The rifle was in her hands before she had finished writing her name. Master Sergeant Kessler had waited for that. He'd waited the way a man waits who has built a small kingdom out of a firing line and does not intend to share it. And when the new arrival set her pen down on the sign-in sheet at the range shack, he was already crossing the gravel with a rifle held out flat across both palms like an offering that was actually a dare. Behind him, strung along the firing line in the flat Georgia heat, 11 of the best long-gun shooters at the detachment stopped what they were doing to watch. Somebody laughed before anything had even happened. That was the part that told you everything. They laughed because they already knew how this went. "You're the shooter they sent us," Kessler said. It wasn't a question. The one from the program nobody's allowed to talk about. He pushed the rifle another inch toward her chest. It was a .338, a big-bore bolt gun set up for someone else's shoulder, someone else's eye, wearing a scope with the elevation dialed to a number that meant nothing to her. Steals out at the 1100 plate. Wins doing whatever it wants today. No dope card, no solver, no spotter. He smiled with the bottom half of his face. Cold bore, 1 round. Show us what the program taught you. Now there is a thing worth understanding about a challenge like that, because Kessler understood it perfectly and was counting on the rest of them not to. A cold bore shot is the first round out of a barrel that has been sitting clean and quiet, and it never quite goes where the warm rounds go. The metal is a different temperature. The first bullet lays down its own thin film of copper and carbon that every round after it will ride on. A cold bore shot at 1100 yards on a borrowed rifle with no data in shifting wind is not a test of skill. It is a coin flip that a man hands you so he can watch it land on its edge and call it your failure. The woman signing in was named Larkin, Sergeant First Class Marin Larkin, 33 years old, 5'6", with sun lines at the corners of her eyes that were older than her face and hands that were very still. She looked at the rifle. She did not take it right away, and the not taking it right away made one of the younger shooters snort, because to him it read as fear. It was not fear. Behind that flat expression, in the place where Marin actually lived, a machine had already started running that most people do not have and cannot build. She was looking at the flags at the base of the berm and reading how the wind broke around the tower. She was watching the mirage boil off the 200-yard line and go glassy at 4. She was clocking the sun's angle, the smell of the air, the way the grass laid over near the target and stood up near the tower, which told her the wind out there wasn't the wind here. In the length of time it took Kessler to smile, she had estimated the range wasn't a clean 1100, but closer to 1140 by the way the plate sat against the tree line, and she had already begun assembling, without a calculator, without paper, a firing solution the way other people assemble a grocery list. She took the rifle. She didn't dry fire it or make a show of checking the action. She lay down in the dirt without brushing it first, built her position in about 4 seconds, and put her cheek to a stock that had been set for a man with a longer neck. Everyone waited for her to reach up and start clicking the turret, dialing in guesses. She didn't touch it. Instead, she found the target in the reticle, and she held. She held high and she held left, a correction she was doing entirely inside the glass, entirely inside her own head, holding off for a wind she'd measured with her eyes, and a drop she'd solved with arithmetic. Nobody had taught her, because nobody could. There was one more thing, the thing that separated her from every good shooter on that line, and it was the reason a program that no longer officially existed had once been built around her specifically. At 1100 yards, a bullet is in the air long enough for the Earth to move underneath it. The planet's rotation nudges the round sideways. The spin of the bullet off a right-hand barrel walks it a hair to the right. A crosswind doesn't just push the bullet, it makes the nose yaw and jumps the whole trajectory a fraction the instant it leaves the muzzle. These are real forces. They are small. At close range, they are noise. At this range, they are the difference between a hit and a story you tell about the day you almost. Most shooters let a computer stack those numbers. Marin stacked them herself in her body in less time than it took her lungs to empty. She let half her breath go, found the still point at the bottom of it, and pressed the trigger straight back so gently that the shot surprised even her, which is exactly how a good shot should feel. For a full second and a half, there was nothing. just the crack rolling out across the range and coming back off the tree line, and 11 men waiting to laugh. Then the plate rang. It was a clean, bright, unmistakable sound, steel taking a heavy round dead center, and it carried back to the firing line and hung there in the heat. Nobody said anything. The snorting kid wasn't snorting anymore. Kessler's smile had gone somewhere and not come back. Marin ejected the empty, caught it out of the air out of habit, and stood up, brushing the dirt off her front now that it no longer mattered whether they thought she was afraid of it. If you have ever wanted to know exactly what a firing line, full of men who are used to being the best in the room, sounds like when it goes completely silent, it sounds like that. Like 11 people all deciding at once not to be the first one to speak. She handed the rifle back to Kessler, grip first. "Barrel's got maybe 40 rounds left before that throat shot out," she said, quietly, not unkindly. You should pull it before it walks on you in front of somebody who matters." Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the detachment building to find someone who could tell her where she was supposed to sleep. She had been on the installation for 11 minutes. The advanced marksmanship detachment sat on the far southeast corner of the post, past the ranges everybody else used, down a road that turned to dirt for the last half-mile because nobody important drove out there. It was its own little country. The men who worked there were the kind the regular army sends when a problem needs a bullet placed inside a window from a mile away. And they knew it, and they carried it, the way men carry a thing they've earned and are afraid of losing. Into that country, without ceremony, the Army had dropped a woman with a classified file and a reputation nobody could confirm and told them to make room. The duty NCO, a broad kid named Corporal Reston, stood up too fast when she came in, the way you stand when you've heard about someone before you've met them. He got her a rack assignment, a facility badge, and a briefing packet, and he told her that Lieutenant Colonel Merrick wanted to see her at 1400, and that morning accountability was at 06, and that the detachment ran its first relay at 0730. He also told her, because he was young enough to still say the quiet things out loud, that Master Sergeant Kessler ran the line and had been running it for a long time. "I got that impression," Marin said. She didn't open the packet. She tucked it under her arm and went to find the kennel of this place, which for her meant the armory and the ready line. Because a detachment tells you the truth about itself in how it keeps its rifles, the same way a house tells you the truth about itself in how it keeps its kitchen. What she found in the armory told her a story she did not like. The person keeping it was a compact, precise woman named Chief Warrant Officer Priya Anand, a gunsmith and ballistician who had spent enough years being the smartest person in rooms full of men who assumed she was there to file paperwork that she had stopped bothering to manage anyone's feelings about it. Anand was bent over a bore scope when Marin walked in, and she looked up with the flat readiness of someone braced for another person who wouldn't understand what she was looking at. Marin understood exactly what she was looking at. That the throat erosion on the .338 I just shot? Anand blinked, recalibrated, set the scope down. "That's the one. I've been telling them for 2 months it's cooked. Master Sergeant keeps it on the line because it's the gun the new people get handed." She said it without inflection, but the meaning sat there anyway. "So it's a hazing gun. It's a gun that makes people miss," Anand said. "So the ones who were already sure you'd miss get to be right." That was the first thread. The second one she found the next morning at the 0730 relay, and it had a name. The name was Specialist Cody Ledford, and Cody Ledford could not shoot anymore, and everyone on the line had quietly agreed not to look directly at it. He was maybe 22, tall and thin and eager in a way that had been sanded down to something painful to watch. On paper, he was one of the most naturally gifted shooters the detachment had brought in during the past 3 years. In practice, he had developed what shooters call a flinch, and what the honest ones call the yips, an anticipatory jerk at the moment of the shot that the conscious mind cannot override because it doesn't live in the conscious mind. His body had learned to be afraid of the recoil the way a body learns to be afraid of a hot stove, and now, a quarter second before every trigger break, some deep animal part of him clenched and threw the round wide, and he knew it was happening, and knowing made it worse, which is the particular cruelty of that specific affliction. He'd been good. Being good was the thing that was killing him. He remembered exactly what he used to be able to do, and the memory sat next to his failure every single time and mocked him. Kessler had a way of dealing with Ledford, and the way was to make him shoot last, and loud, and in front of everyone, on the theory that a man just needed to be embarrassed hard enough to knock it out of him. It's worth saying plainly, because the detachment believed it and it is wrong. You cannot shame a flinch out of a person. Shame is the fuel the flinch runs on. Every time Kessler stood behind Ledford and narrated his failure to the line, he was not curing the problem. He was practicing it. He was carving the groove deeper. Marin watched one full relay of this without saying a word, standing off to the side with her arms crossed, and what the men read as detachment was in fact the most focused attention any of them had received in a long time. She was watching Ledford's trigger hand, and the tendon in his forearm, and the little collapse in his shoulder, a beat before each shot. She was doing what she did with everything, which was to break it down into forces and measure them. And by the end of the relay, she understood Cody Ledford completely, better than he understood himself. And she understood something else too, which was that fixing him would cost her exactly the kind of political capital she did not have and could not afford to spend in her first week. She decided to spend it anyway, not for the reason the men would eventually assume, which was to prove a point against Kessler. She decided to fix him because he could be fixed, and a thing that can be fixed and is instead left broken is a specific kind of waste that she had spent her whole career unable to walk past. The meeting with Marek came that afternoon, and it was the meeting that told her the ground under this place was worse than she'd guessed. Lieutenant Colonel Ansel Marek was a lean, tired man with an office too small for his rank and a way of looking at people like he was trying to read a document in bad light. He did not waste time. He told her he'd requested her by name, that he'd read what he was cleared to read of her file, which he admitted was not much, and that most of what mattered about her was classified above his access. Then he told her the thing. You know Colonel Ostrander's on the evaluation board that's coming out next month, Marek said. For the certification. Marin went very still. It was a small movement, or rather a small absence of movement, but Marek was a man who read documents in bad light, and he caught it. You want to tell me why that name just changed the temperature in here? He said. She told him. She kept it clean and flat, the way she'd learned to talk about it. Ostrander was the officer who had shut down Project Meridian. Meridian had been a small, strange program built around a simple, unfashionable bet that in a fight where the electronics failed, where the ballistic computers and the laser rangefinders and the satellite feeds were jammed or dead or lied to, the thing that would still put a round on a target at a mile was a human being who could do the mathematics in their own head under fire. It had cost money. It had produced very few people, because very few people could do what it required. And Ostrander, who was not a stupid man, had argued that it was operationally untenable to build a capability around a handful of freaks of arithmetic when a $2,000 box on a rail could do the same math faster and never got scared. He'd won the argument. He'd killed the program. And 2 years later, on a mountainside in a country Marin still couldn't name in an unclassified room, every box on every rail had gone dark at once under electronic attack, and the only rounds that found their targets that night had come from the 2 people on that ridge who had been trained by a program that no longer existed. One of them had been Marin. The other one had not come home. She had written that up. She had documented what the failure of the equipment had cost and what the human capability had saved. And she had filed it, and it had been received and buried, and she had kept a copy of it in a personal archive. For 3 years, the way you keep a photograph of someone you couldn't save. Not as ammunition, as a record, as proof that a thing had been true. Marek listened to all of it without interrupting, which was its own kind of respect. So the officer who decided people like you were obsolete, he said when she finished, is going to sit on the board that decides whether this detachment gets certified. And you're the ringer I brought in to help us pass. Yes, sir. Marek rubbed his eyes. The dog in the ring your first morning, he said, and then caught himself, because that wasn't the phrase. That was some other story. The rifle Kessler handed you. He set you up to fail in front of the line. He did. And you didn't. No, sir. Why not just dial the turret and miss quietly and let it go? Save yourself the enemy. Marin considered that honestly because it was a fair question. Because the plate doesn't care who's shooting, she said finally. The wind doesn't care what anybody on that line thinks of me. The math is the same whether they respect it or not. If I'd missed on purpose, I'd have been lying to the only thing out here that tells the truth. She paused. I'm not good at lying to that. Marek looked at her for a long moment. Don't waste it, he said, which was almost exactly the thing another commander had said to her once in another life, and she didn't tell him that. She started on Cody Ledford the next morning, before the sun was fully up, before anyone else was on the line, which was deliberate. The first thing she did was take his ammunition away, not to punish him, to lie to him gently in a way that told the truth. She had him shoot at 50 yards with a rifle she'd loaded herself, and she loaded it with a mix he couldn't see, some rounds live and some rounds nothing but a primed case that would make the trigger break and the firing pin fall on nothing at all. This is an old drill, and there is nothing mystical about it. Its entire purpose is to catch the flinch in the act. Because when Ledford's body clenched and threw the muzzle down, and to the left in anticipation of a recoil that never came, he could see it. The rifle didn't move because there was nothing to move it except him. He watched his own crosshair dive off the target on an empty chamber, and there was no bang to blame it on, no recoil to hide behind, and he understood in a way no amount of Kessler's shouting had ever made him understand that the thing throwing his rounds was not the rifle and not bad luck. It was him. It was his own fear, wearing his own muscles. He was quiet for a while after that. Then, in a low voice, he said, "How do I make it stop?" "You don't make it stop," Marin said. "You make it smaller. You build it a smaller and smaller room to live in until it can't reach the trigger anymore." She said it the way she said everything, without drama, conversational, the way you'd tell someone the wind was picking up. It took months to teach your body to be afraid. We're going to spend a few weeks teaching it something else. It's going to feel slow. Slow is the point. That was the philosophy, and it was the exact philosophy Meridian had been killed for, and it was the exact philosophy that the detachment, in the person of Master Sergeant Kessler, was built to resist. Faster is better. Harder is better. A man just needs to be broken correctly. Marin's whole method was the heresy that some things cannot be rushed because they are not made of the kind of material that responds to force, that a nervous system is not a recruit and cannot be smoked into compliance, that recovery and repetition and patience were not softness, but a longer, harder road to a place that shouting could never reach. Not everyone on the line thought she was wrong. The first one to come around was Sergeant First Class Roan Mercer, the senior spotter, a weathered man who'd been calling wind for other people's rifles for 15 years and had watched more shooters come and go than he could count. He was the kind of man who didn't bother with preamble because he'd spent too many years in places where preamble was a luxury. He came to her on the fourth day and stood next to her while she watched Ledford dry fire, and after a while he said, "Meridian, you were really in it." "I was. Everybody says it was a boondoggle. Money pit. Bunch of guys doing party tricks with numbers. Some people say that." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "I called for a team on a ridge 2 years back," he said, not looking at her. "Comms went to hell. Everything on the rail went stupid at the same time, whole elements blind, and 2 guys just kept hitting. No box, no laser, nothing. Held the whole thing together till we could break contact." He finally looked at her. "That was your program, wasn't it? That capability?" "Yes," Marin said. "It was." Mercer nodded slowly, and something shifted in his face, and he didn't say anything else. But from that day on, when she ran a drill, he made sure his own younger spotters watched it, and that was worth more than any speech. The sabotage she found in the second week, and she found it the way she found everything, through arithmetic. She'd been keeping her own data on the detachment's ammunition because that was simply what she did, and the numbers on one particular lot didn't sit right. The velocities were off from what the lot should have produced, off in a way that was consistent, which meant it wasn't random, which meant either the ammunition was mislabeled or someone had swapped it. A shooter working off a dope card built on one velocity, firing rounds that actually left the barrel 40 feet per second slower, would throw low at distance and never understand why. Small at 400, at 1,000 a miss, At an evaluation, a career, she pulled the lot numbers, she pulled the range logs, and what she found was that the logs had been signed off as verified by Master Sergeant Kessler, certifying that the detachment's evaluation ammunition had been chronographed and matched to the solvers, when in fact the numbers didn't match anything, and the shooters heading into certification were building their firing solutions on a foundation that was quietly, deniably false. It was the kind of thing that would never be provable as intent. It could always be called a clerical error, but the effect of it, whether he'd meant it or not, was that the detachment was walking into an evaluation with Colonel Ostrander watching, set up to fail, on ammunition nobody could trust. She took it to Anand first, because Anand could confirm the ballistics, and because Anand had been screaming into a void about the state of that range for 2 months and deserved to be the one holding the proof. Anand ran the chronograph herself 3 times, and when the numbers came up, she took off her glasses and set them down very deliberately on the bench and said, "I have been the base gunsmith here for 3 years, and I have written this up 4 times, and every time it goes into a drawer." She looked at Marin. "It's not going into a drawer this time, is it?" "No," Marin said. "It's not." Here is where the story could have become the thing the men were already telling themselves it was. The thing where the woman uses the sabotage to destroy the man who humiliated her. The revenge story, the one where she marches into Merrick's office with a folder and burns Kessler down. That is not what she did, and the reason she didn't is the reason the whole story turns. She fixed the ammunition first. That was the actual problem. The men going to certification were the actual thing that mattered, and destroying Kessler didn't put a single correct round in a single rifle. So she and Anand spent 2 nights re-chronographing every lot, rebuilding every dope card off real numbers, hand-verifying the solutions for every shooter and every rifle on the line, so that whatever else happened, the detachment would walk onto that range firing on the truth. Only after that was done did she write it up, cleanly, factually, no adjectives, and hand it to Merrick, and the write-up did not ask for Kessler's head. It asked for a re-verification protocol and a second signature requirement on evaluation ammunition. It described a broken process. It let the facts about the person who'd broken it speak for themselves, which they did, and which was worse for him than any accusation she could have made, because a process failure with his signature on it, going into a certification, in front of a colonel, was the kind of thing the Army does not forgive and cannot unsee. He'd handed her a gun on the first day to make her miss. He'd built himself a much bigger miss without any help from her at all. The 3 weeks she'd promised Ledford came down to the last few days before the evaluation, and by then the young shooter was not the same person. The empty case drill had become clean position work, and clean position work had become live rounds at short distance where every hit was a small deposit against the debt of every miss, and the small deposits had started to add up into something he could feel. The flinch wasn't gone. She'd told him it wouldn't be, but it had a smaller room now. He could get to the trigger before it got to him, most of the time, and the most of the time was growing. The night before the board arrived, Marin did something she told no one about except Merrick, and she told him only because she needed his authorization for it. She had the range crew build a hide into the certification course, a target problem so hard that she wasn't sure she could solve it herself. A small steel plate at just over 1,000 yards, positioned behind a false crest so that a shooter couldn't range it directly. In a saddle where the wind coming off 2 ridgelines met and fought and reversed itself halfway to the target, so that the wind you read at the muzzle was the opposite of the wind that mattered at the plate. It was a problem that a ballistic computer would get wrong, because a computer solves for the wind you can measure, and the wind that killed you out there was the wind you had to reason your way to. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of problem Meridian had existed to solve and Ostrander had declared no longer worth solving. She didn't tell anyone which shooter she wanted on it. She had decided, though. She'd decided it would be Cody Ledford. The evaluation ran for 2 days. Colonel Ostrander sat behind the line, under a canvas fly with a clipboard and a second evaluator, a sharp major named Corso, who wrote down everything and gave nothing away. Ostrander was older than Marin remembered, grayer, and when he'd arrived and their eyes had met across the range for the first time in 3 years, there had been a moment, brief and real, where the whole dead argument stood up between them again, fully alive. He'd held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then he'd looked back down at his clipboard, and that was the entire conversation they had for a day and a half. The shooters performed. On real ammunition, on solutions Marin and Anand had rebuilt from the ground up, they performed well better than a detachment that had spent 2 months quietly firing on lies had any right to. Mercer called wind like a man reading his own handwriting. The relays clicked through the distances, 400, 6, 8, 1,000, steel ringing across the course, and Corso's pen moved and Ostrander's face did not. Then came the last problem, the one behind the false crest, and Marin walked to the line and in front of the board called Ledford's name. There was a small stir. Somebody on the line knew what Ledford had been 6 weeks ago and understood correctly that she had just put the most fragile shooter in the detachment on the hardest shot on the course in front of a colonel. Kessler, standing at the edge of the fly under a cloud he could feel gathering over his own career, watched with an expression that had a great deal riding on the young man failing. Ledford came to the line. He was pale. His hands, when he built his position, were not perfectly steady, and Marin saw it, and she did not fix it for him, because she couldn't, and because the whole point was that he had to be the one holding the rifle when the room went quiet. She lay down beside him as his spotter. She did not solve the shot for him. She'd promised herself she wouldn't. What she did instead, in a low voice that only he could hear, was walk beside him through his own reasoning. "You can't range it directly," she said. "So range what you can, the rock face left of the crest. Work it from there." He did. "The flags are lying to you. The wind here isn't the wind out there. Look at the saddle. Look at the grass in the saddle." He looked, and she watched him do the thing she had been unable to teach anyone who couldn't already almost do it. Watched him reason his way to a wind he could not feel on his own face, out at a plate he could barely see, stacking the corrections in an order she had drilled into him until the order was his and not hers. He built his hold, high and into a wind that ran opposite to the one on his cheek, a hold that would have looked insane to anyone who trusted the flags. He settled, and the animal in his shoulder, the fear that had lived in him for a year and thrown 100 rounds into the dirt, tightened, right on schedule, a quarter second out. But it had a smaller room now. He got to the trigger first. He pressed it straight back and the rifle fired, and the round went out over the false crest into the fighting wind. And for 2 full seconds there was nothing at all, just the crack rolling out and the whole line holding one breath together. The plate rang. It was a small plate, a long way off, in the worst wind on the course, and a young man who 6 weeks earlier could not have hit the berm had just put a first round through the center of it. The sound came back across the range clean and bright and impossible, and it hung in the heat exactly the way the first shot had hung on Marin's first morning, and nobody said a word. Ledford didn't move for a moment. Then his breath went out of him all at once, a long, ragged exhale that had a whole year in it, and he pressed his forehead against the stock and just breathed. Marin put her hand flat on the back of his shoulder once and took it away. Under the fly, Corso stopped riding, and Colonel Ostrander stood up. He came down to the line himself, which he had not done once in a day and a half, and he stood over the young shooter still lying in the dirt, and then he looked at Marin, who had gotten to her feet. "That problem," Ostrander said. "You built it." "Yes, sir. There's no computer that solves that." "No, sir. There isn't." He was quiet. The old argument was standing between them again, and this time it had a witness lying in the dirt with his forehead on a rifle. "The program," Ostrander said finally. It wasn't a question and it wasn't quite an apology. It was a fact he was setting down on the ground between them. "Meridian. I shut it down." "You did," Marin said. She didn't say it with heat. There wasn't any heat left in it for her. There was just the plate, still ringing somewhere in her memory, and the thing that was always true. "I read the after action," Ostrander said more quietly so the line couldn't hear. "From the ridge, 2 years ago, the night everything on the rail went dark." He paused. "I read it after, when it didn't matter anymore." He looked out at the false crest, at the plate a young man had just impossibly hit. One of the 2 people who kept shooting that night didn't come back. "No," Marin said. "He didn't." Ostrander was silent for a long moment. He was not a stupid man, and that had always been the hardest part. It would have been easier if he were. I was solving for the budget, he said. I was solving for the wind I could measure. He let that sit because he was a man who understood exactly what he had just admitted. Then he looked back at Ledford, at the shooter Marin had rebuilt out of nothing but time and patience and a refusal to walk past waste. Teach them what you did to him, he said. As many as can learn it. I'll find the money. He didn't apologize, not in words, but he wrote something on his clipboard, and later that week the recommendation that came off that board did not just certify the detachment. It recommended in careful language that the capability Colonel Ostrander had personally ended 3 years before be reconstituted in a limited form, under the instruction of the non-commissioned officer who had proven it still worked. He would have to answer, up his own chain, for having killed a thing he was now asking to resurrect. He did it anyway. That was the closest a man like Ostrander came to saying he'd been wrong, and Marin, who had carried a copy of a buried report for 3 years, understood it perfectly and let it be enough. Kessler was gone within the month, not fired, not court-martialed, nothing so clean as that. The falsified verification logs, sitting under a colonel's certification, generated the kind of quiet, formal inquiry the Army reserves for process failures that could have gotten people killed, and the inquiry did not need Marin to say a single word against him, because his own signature said all of it. He was reassigned somewhere far from a firing line to a job where nothing he signed could put a bad number under someone else's trigger. There was no triumph in it for her. She'd have preferred he simply be someone who didn't do it. But sabotaging the thing you're supposed to protect is a career-ending act, and it ends the career whether or not the person you tried to sabotage ever lifts a finger. Late that night, after the board had gone and the range was dark, Marin walked the empty firing line the way she always did, taking inventory with every sense. Because a place tells you the truth about itself when everyone's gone home. The steel plates out on the course caught what little moonlight there was and gave back nothing. Somewhere behind the false crest, the small plate that had ended a young man's year of failure hung in the dark, ordinary again, just steel. She found Cody Ledford still there, sitting on the tailgate of a truck near the ammo point, not doing anything, just sitting with the particular stillness of a person who has set down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten. It wasn't part of his body. You didn't have to put me on that shot, he said when she walked up. In front of the colonel, if I'd choked. You weren't going to choke, Marin said. You didn't know that. She considered lying to make him feel good and decided against it because he'd earned the truth and because the truth was better anyway. No, she admitted. I didn't know it, but I knew the work was real. I knew the numbers were real. The plate doesn't care whether you believe in yourself, Ledford. It doesn't grade your confidence. It only answers to whether you did the math and held your position and got to the trigger before the fear did. She looked out at the dark course. You did. That's not a feeling. That's a fact. Nobody gets to take a fact away from you. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, thank you. And she could hear in it that he meant something much larger than the words. She didn't say you're welcome. She'd never been good at that part. She just knocked her knuckles once against the tailgate, the way you'd pat a good animal that had done exactly what it was built to do, and told him to get some sleep, and walked on. The thing about a bullet is that it is the most honest object in the world. It does not know your rank. It does not know your name or your sex or which program you came from or who laughed at you on your first morning. It leaves the barrel and it obeys with perfect indifference only the forces that are actually acting on it, the drop in the drift and the wind and the turn of the earth, and it arrives exactly where those forces send it, and no opinion in the world can move it a hair off that path. All the machismo on that firing line, all the certainty, all the years of a man being sure a woman would miss, none of it had a single unit of force in it. It couldn't push a bullet. Only the truth could. And the truth was that Marin Larkin had walked into that place with a duffel bag and no welcome. And 3 years of a buried report she'd carried like a stone and had been right, quietly and completely, about every single thing that actually mattered, and the steel had said so out loud in a language no one on that line could argue with. She had never needed them to believe her. She'd only needed the plate to ring. And in the end, out there where the wind couldn't be flattered and the math couldn't be shouted down, that was the only voice that had ever counted.